I don't know about you, but I've always found it to be really difficult to define and kind of nail down the Advent season. But something which can be really helpful in this regard is to reflect upon the structure of the entire season. And so to kind of talk about things slightly out of order, I want to begin by talking about the Christmas season. So basically Christmas begins on December 25th, and Christmas itself, Christmas proper, actually lasts for 8 days, the so-called octave of Christmas. So it runs from December 25th all the way through to the Solemnity of Mary, Mother of God. So again, 8 days, the octave of Christmas. But then the Christmas season actually lasts a lot longer. And so the Christmas season begins on December 25th and includes the so-called 12 days of Christmas. So the 12 days running from December 25th to the Feast of the Epiphany, and then includes the 8 days from the Epiphany to the baptism of our Lord. And that officially concludes the Christmas season. But anyways, and kind of more to the point, the Advent season is obviously the season in which immediately precedes the Christmas season. And again, we can look to define the particular theme of Advent by looking at the structure of the season. And so the very word Advent means coming, which speaks to the fact that obviously we're called to prepare for the coming of Christ. But actually, there's two comings, right? So first of all, there's the first coming, the birth of the child Jesus in a manger in Bethlehem. But also, of course, there's the second coming, where Christ will come back to judge the living and the dead in the context of the end times and the final judgment. Now, it just so happens that the season of Advent is divided into 4 weeks, right? So during the first 2 weeks of Advent, we focus on the second coming, the final judgment, the end times. The final 2 weeks, there's a shift. We focus on the marriage of humanity and divinity in the very person of Christ. And so throughout the Advent season, the predominant color is purple, to indicate some penitential aspect to the season of Advent. The final 2 weeks, there's a shift from purple to rose, otherwise known as pink, to signify joy, which we'll come back to in a moment, before it finally shifts back to purple in the context of the fourth Sunday of Advent. And so you notice that at the very beginning of Mass, corresponding to each of the Sunday Masses during the season of Advent, there's the lighting of the Advent wreath, which is really notable and instructive. And so the wreath is obviously a circle and is composed of evergreen leaves, which both point to the everlasting and eternal love of God for us. There's also 4 candles signifying the light of Christ, which we light one weekend at a time. And each of these obviously means something. And so the first candle is the prophet's candle, pointing to the virtue of hope. The second candle is the Bethlehem candle, pointing to the virtue of faith. The third candle is the shepherd's candle, so it points to the notion of joy. And then the final candle is the angel's candle, which points to the notion of peace. So in light of everything we just said today, in terms of the structure of the season of Advent, hopefully you can see what we're meant to focus on in the context of the first Sunday of Advent. And so obviously we're called to prepare our hearts for the coming of Christ. And because we find ourselves in the first couple weeks of Advent, we're called to focus on the second coming of Christ, when again he will eventually come back to judge the living and the dead in the context of the end times. But then on top of that, when we look at the Advent wreath, obviously we are lighting the prophet's candle, alluding to the fact that the Old Testament prophets had long foretold the coming of the Messiah, who is now coming and in a certain sense is already here, as a result of which we're called to be filled with hope. And this is captured in today's Gospel from the Gospel of Luke chapter 21. And so basically what we hear in the context of the Gospel, just to kind of paraphrase, is that a lot of people will be paralyzed by fear when it comes to the end times and the very thought of the final judgment. But then the Gospel basically goes on to say that it must not be so amongst you, because your redemption is at hand. And so the invitation and the challenge here is, in a certain sense, to adopt the mentality of the early Christians, who are so eager for the second coming of Christ that such people as St. Paul and St. Peter had to kind of talk them down, to remind them that probably Christ wasn't going to come back in the course of their own lifetimes. And so they had to kind of build and plant and think big picture, long game. But again, more to the point, we too are called to adopt the mentality and the spirit and the excitement of the early Christians, to adopt for ourselves the virtue of hope, the sense of a joyful expectation, to really adopt for ourselves the wording and the spirit of the Nicene Creed, in the sense of actually looking forward to the resurrection of the dead and the life of the world to come. Now, obviously, even though you might agree in principle with that particular invitation to receive the notion of the second coming with joyful expectation and a spirit of hope, you still might feel a sense of foreboding and fear at the very thought of the final judgment and the end times. And so with that in mind, I want to give you two practical bits of advice. And so the first thing that comes to mind is to develop a proper notion and a proper image as to what we mean when we talk about the end times. Because I think, to be honest, a lot of people look at the end times in a sort of reductive and even false kind of way. And so a lot of people, for example, look at the end times as basically a family reunion. So all it is a bunch of people coming together, the living and the dead, in the context of a sweeping meadow and a babbling brook. Or perhaps on top of that, people look at the end times as this moment when Jesus Christ will take away everything I hold dear, whereas in reality, the occasion of the end times is this moment of fulfillment, where we see the greatness of God's providence, where He brings together all the various strands of human history. There'll be no sense of lack, no sense of want. When we look back at human history in light of God's providence, we will see that not only was He able to bring about good in the midst of difficult circumstances, we will see that this is how it had to be. Things had to play out in a very particular way to bring about the greater good, to bring about God's ultimate designs. Now that said, when it comes to the end times, and in particular our tendency to give into a certain fear and foreboding when it comes to the very thought of the end times, something which is really important to note is that an important prerequisite to having peace, a deep sense of peace in the human heart, is to live out of a stance of integrity. Integrity as opposed to a lack of integrity. And so the example that comes to mind, think about the sacrament of confession, right? And so obviously I'm a priest, and because I'm a priest, I've heard a lot of confessions over the years. And sometimes people will ask me directly or implicitly for advice in terms of basically, should I worry about this particular thing happening in my life? And my answer is different depending on the circumstances. And so, for example, a lot of people will come and say, well, look, I'm doing this thing, or I made a certain kind of choice. Is God displeased by that? Should I be worried about that? Is this a sin? And sometimes I'll say to them, well, no, it's not. Don't worry about it. Just move on with your life without worrying about that particular dynamic in your life. On the other hand, there's other people who come to confession, and the vibe is like, look, I tend to be kind of scrupulous. I tend to worry about things I shouldn't be worried about. Here's this thing which is going on in my life. Should I be worried about that? To which I will say to them, well, actually, yes. And in fact, even if you're not worried about it, you should worry about it, because that's actually something really important that you should rectify. Now, that might sound like a bit of a contradiction, but it speaks to this earlier point that we just kind of raised, right? So we all want peace, right? But if you're not living from a space of integrity, if you're not in right relationship with God, you will never have deep and lasting peace. So instead of telling people to back away or to not judge you or whatever people tell themselves in that particular moment, you should just basically be honest, look at the way that you're called to change, amend your life, and then change in that particular way. In the aftermath, you'll probably find very quickly that peace of heart will very quickly return. We're often inclined to think that shame is automatically a bad thing, but in reality, it can be good or it can be bad. And so, for example, shame is bad if it leads you to a sense of, I'm no good, I'm unloved, that sort of thing, right? So if it impinges on your sense of identity, therefore it's not good. Shame is also not from the Lord if you find yourself constantly revisiting things that you brought up in a sacrament confession. And so, for example, let's say you brought up a particular sin in the context of the sacrament confession. So you brought up in a sacrament confession, you've made amends, you made reparation for that particular sin. And also, really important, you have a firm resolution in your heart to avoid committing that sin again in the future. Then if the devil brings up that particular sin again to you in the future, if you've already brought it up and you've done those things I just mentioned, well then again, that's a bad shame that is not from the Lord, but in fact is from the devil. Now, on the other hand, there's what's called good shame. And good shame is something like this. So let's say you've committed a serious sin, which has brought you out of a stance of right relationship with God, and you're not doing anything about it, right? So you haven't gone to confession, you haven't done anything to make amends or make reparation for the thing that you've done or failed to do, and you feel bad, and you're worried about this particular dynamic being brought out in the open. Well, that's a good thing, right? That's a good shame, which is meant to lead you back into a right relationship with God. And so what you're supposed to do, instead of ignoring this particular feeling, whatever the case may be, you're called to face this thing, go to confession, make amends, make reparation, and to try your best to not commit this particular sin going forward in the future. If all those things are in place, well then, yeah, you should have peace of heart. And again, it will return sooner rather than later. Okay, one final example, and I'll kind of end with this. So one of the greatest and youngest saints in our Catholic tradition is St. Dominic Savio, who died at the age of 14. And so basically he lived in the 19th century, and there's this really interesting story involving him and St. Don Bosco, where basically St. Dominic Savio and a bunch of boys were playing soccer in a field. And then St. Don Bosco approached him and said, well, what if the world was going to end in a couple weeks? What would you boys do? And so the first boy said, well, look, I would go to church and I would pray all sorts of prayers, making reparation for my sins, that type of thing. The second boy thought, well, that's a pretty good answer, so that's my answer too. And the third boy was St. Dominic Savio. And basically what he said was, I will continue playing soccer in the field. And of course, that's the right answer because he's St. Dominic Savio. And hopefully you could see the brilliance behind that particular statement, behind that particular story. And so certainly if you read between the lines, you don't get the sense that St. Dominic Savio was calm because he was indifferent to the final judgments or the end times. No, you get the sense that he knew intuitively that peace only comes when you have integrity of heart. And so it's not too hard to imagine that he had goodwill, this habitual desire to go God's way, not to mention this habit of prayer and frequenting the sacraments, especially the sacrament of confession, especially regular Mass. And on top of that, it's not too hard to imagine that when things fell out of place, as they sometimes do, in terms of falling out of right relationship with God, he would immediately make a beeline to the confessional, confess his sins, make reparation, make amends, have a firm resolution to not commit that sin going forward in the future, in the aftermath of which, again, peace would immediately return to his heart. But hopefully you see the point. If you live in this way, if you live with integrity, good habits, goodwill, this habitual desire to go God's way, then you have freedom to glorify God through every aspect of your life, your work, your play, your prayer, even by doing something as simple as playing soccer in a field. And may God bless you all.